Welcome and good afternoon. This is Commish Orr, and today I have a question that has arisen that I wanted to ask everybody about, and I would love to hear your comments down in the comment section on this topic. So I'm putting together. Let me start by saying that normally most of the sims that I do are fantasy, we'll say, because they're taking, like for example, in my Payoff Pitch League, I take Hall of Famers and draft a set of teams. And so it's Hall of Fame teams playing against each other or non Hall of Fame teams playing against the Hall of Famers and that kind of thing. So it's not a real life situation because these players were never on the team together. And so in those cases, I have to create a lineup and pitching rotation and that kind of thing on my own. So I haven't really played much historical, not necessarily as played, but historical Sims before. Well, in my season ticket baseball project that I'm going to be starting, I'm doing a best of the decades. And the first decade I'm doing is the 1930s. So I have 5 American and 5 National League teams that are going to be competing in a tournament, a series tournament. So best of 5 at each level of the tournament, double elimination. And so they have to lose 2 series to be out. And in putting together those lineups and such, obviously these are historical teams from the 1930s. And so as I've been putting those together, my first thought was to just use I can't use as played lineups because they didn't play in a tournament in real life, obviously. But I do have access, obviously, through Baseball Reference to their most often used lineups and that kind of thing. So I thought I'll just pick, who was most frequently the leadoff hitter, who was most frequently number 2, number 3, and so forth for each team. And I just kind of use the teams like that. But as I was putting together these teams, a question kind of was nagging at me a little bit. And that question is, do you make changes to the historical lineups or rotations, or do you just let it ride? And I know that there are a lot of people that do as played lineups and as played pitching rotations and that kind of thing. And in those cases, I'm sure you just go based on whoever was whatever the lineup was that day, whatever the pitcher was that day, and you don't really think too much about it. But for those of you who don't, you do strictly as played lineups or as played rotations, do you make any changes to the historical lineups and rotations based on modern sensibilities, or you just let it ride? Case in point, in the 1930s, I've done some digging because when I was looking at some of these pitching rotations in particular, I noticed that there were a lot of pitchers that pitched had a lot of games started. It wasn't a strict 3 or 4 man rotation or 5 man rotation or whatever, but there were a lot of pitchers that were used in starts. A lot of the starters were used in relief. Even the top starters were used in relief quite a bit. And when I was digging into it a little bit and reading and researching and that kind of thing, something became obvious to me. I kind of had forgotten about it, but I was reminded of it. And that is that in the 1930s and the early 20th century of baseball, there wasn't really a pitching rotation as we would think of it now. Teams would use starters whenever. So if a starter was particularly good against a certain team, they would save that starter until that team was coming up in the schedule. So a particular starter may get 6 or 7 days rest because they knew a certain team was going to be on the schedule coming up and they were going to save that starter for that particular team. Likewise, he could pitch on 2 days rest because they're in a series with a specific team and they wanted him to get an extra start against that team that he's done well against. And so there wasn't really a pitching rotation the way we think of it now, where it was like strictly in order. They would just choose a pitcher based on that particular day and situation. And so, knowing that, it kind of reframed my thinking about what to do in these, non-modern baseball replays. And so even for those of you who use an as played lineup, do you find that if it's down to, you know, down to the end of the season, do you tweak the lineup at all if there's somebody in there that is a horrible hitter that we probably wouldn't have in that spot? Or do you just let it ride exactly as it is? And those of you who are doing more non-historical game by game replays, how do you make those decisions, or what do you do to tweak the lineup? Likewise, what do you do in situations during the game? Do you, you know, they pitched a lot more complete games back then. Do you let those complete games ride? Do you let the pitcher stay in, even though he's let up 5-6 runs? Stay in till the 8th or 9th inning because they didn't really use relievers as much in the earlier 20th century baseball. So that's just a question to you. And really, I'm wearing my Yankees gear right now because this question arose specifically when I was looking at the 1939 Yankees lineup. And again, I was just going to use whatever the most popular lineups were. But as I put the lineups together, I realized that the 1939 Yankees lineup was a little odd. A little odd. Now, far be it for me to criticize the 1939 Yankees lineup. The 1939 Yankees were arguably the best team in Major League Baseball history. Only the 1884 St. Louis Maroons have a better run differential on a season. They had a 458 run differential, meaning they scored 458 more runs than they allowed. And that's the top in Major League Baseball history. But number 2 is not the 1927 Yankees. They're number 3 with 371 run differential. But it's the 1939 Yankees with 411 run differential. The Yankees were 106-45 that year. But by the Pythagorean record, they should have been 111-40, I believe. 111-40, I believe, is what the record should have been based on the run differential. And so the again, they won the World Series that year. And so the player in particular that made me question everything was a Yankee that has 8 World Series rings, but is the weak link on the team, if you will. And that player is Frankie Cassetti, Frankie Cressetti, nicknamed the Crow. He spent his entire 17-year career with the Yankees. Of course, he was with the Yankees in that key time frame where the Yankees were dominant in the 30s and 40s. He was part of 17 World Championship teams and 23 World Series participants overall from 1932 to 1964 because he was a coach later. So he was a coach after he retired as a player. And he was a shortstop for the team, for the 1939 team. And they had him as a leadoff hitter. And they didn't mix it up. He was the leadoff hitter in every game that season, I believe. Every game in the 1939 season, Frankie Cressetti was the leadoff hitter. And as I was looking at his stats, it seemed a little strange. Because here he was as a leadoff hitter on the team, and he had a batting average of .233 and an on-base percentage of .315. So he wasn't a great hitter. He was arguably the worst hitter in their starting 9, or starting 8, excuse me, if you add the pitcher in there. But he was leading off every game. And now, granted, he did have 11 stolen bases, but he was caught 7 times. George Selkirk had 12 stolen bases, even more than him, and he hit 306 that year with a 452 on base percentage. So it just seemed strange to me that they had such a weak hitter leading off every game for them. And it made me wonder why first, and should I let that stand? And I thought, I need to tweak some things because that's just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me. Nothing against Frankie Cressetti. As I said, he was on a lot of World Series champion teams. He was on the Yankees during their key time. But even looking at his Wikipedia page, so I kind of tried to research a little bit to figure out, was there a reason that they kept having him bat leadoff the whole time? And even in his own Wikipedia page, it says that he was really considered the weak link in the lineup. So, even in the Wikipedia page about him, it talks about how he was, probably the weakest hitter in the lineup, and yet he was batting leadoff every game of that season. And it wasn't like in 1938. So that's the other thing. It's like, well, maybe he was so good in 1938 that, starting in 1939, you don't know how he's going to end up. Yeah, maybe in 1938 he was so good that they had him leading off in 1939. Not true. His best season was 1936 when he hit 288 with 15 homers, 78 RBI, and 137 runs scored, which are all career highs by him. He hit leadoff that year, and he was American League All-Star for the first time. So maybe it was some carryover for that, just tradition. He was always a leadoff hitter after 36, but it just didn't make sense to me. And so that's kind of why I decided to make some tweaks to that. But then it got me thinking, so that's kind of what I did. I tweaked the lineups of these 1930s era teams. Not many tweaks, but just in cases like that where it was just so strange, I did make some tweaks to the lineup. And again, far be it for me to argue with a team that has the best run differential after 1900 in Major League Baseball history. What could it have been if they didn't have this guy leading off? Could have even been better, maybe. He was considered a pretty slick fielder, though, it says. So, it wasn't like he was a worthless player by any means, but just not not the best leadoff hitter in my opinion. So again, the question comes back: when do you make changes? When do you make edits to things that are just odd to you? The secondary thing that I've thought about is the whole question on DH or no DH, and then like just sacrifices. That's the other thing is like, okay, when it comes to the 1930s teams, obviously pre-DH, all of the pitchers were hitting, and so one would assume a lot of sacrifices, a lot of bunts, because of all the pitchers that are batting. But oddly, that really wasn't the case. If you look at how many sacrifice hits the pitchers had, nobody even had double digits in the lineups that I looked at. Most of the teams, the pitchers had less than 10 sacrifice hits, which means those pitchers were swinging away most of the time. Again, I think it was a different era. So even though we think teams were doing small ball and that kind of thing, and so sacrifices were a lot more happening a lot more. Sure, I think as a whole, the teams were probably doing it more than they are doing now, but the pitchers didn't seem to be doing it as much as modern National League pitchers before the DH was in both leagues have done it. So that's kind of brought up the other question of, do you modify your strategy when you're playing in prior eras based on modern sensibilities? When to steal, when to sacrifice, that kind of thing? Or do you use the modern ways of doing that? Or do you try to model it after the actual era of the teams that are in play? Just something to think about. I think what I did is I'm going with all DH, mostly not because I don't want to make those decisions. I think a lot of those decisions are just kind of automatic. Like in certain situations, there isn't really a decision. If the pitcher is up with no outs with men on, he's going to try to sacrifice. If there's a man on first, for example. So there really aren't very many strategic decisions involved in no DH. And again, I know there could be arguments about that, but not just from that, but I think just getting an extra batter in the lineup, especially in a tournament situation, just seemed more interesting to me. Giving a chance for some of these other bench guys to get more playing time during the tournament seemed more interesting to me, and that's kind of why I did it. But just curious to hear your thoughts on the whole topic. I think I've rambled a little bit, which is fine. But I just really leave some comments down below. Let me know how you do it. If you switch things up, or if things just don't make sense, and you're like, there's no way I'm going to have this guy in the starting lineup in this tournament or whatever that I'm doing, when in real life he was not that great that year. I've tried to also balance the fact that some players, they had much better batting averages, but they only had 30 at bats or whatever. So I try to not put those guys in the starting lineup, if that makes sense. Have some kind of break of when I can put those guys in as starters in the lineup. But with all that said, I think that's where I'll leave things. A little bit of a different video today. As always, you can follow the action on baseballmaelstrom.com. The two projects that I have going on, one is this 1930s Best of the Decades using Season Ticket Baseball. The other one is Season 2 of my Payoff Pitch League with teams of Hall of Famers and non-Hall of Fame teams competing, for American League, 4 National League teams competing in a third of a regular season. So 54 games to see who's best. Season 2. This is Season 2 of that. So be following along if you want to check that out. I'll release some videos of my progress in both of those projects, as well as taking a look at MLB play-by-play data to see now that the shift has been eliminated, if there's changes in out distribution and that kind of thing. So if you're curious about that, I have a whole series of videos that I did about the 2022 season when the shift was still in play. So you can take a look at those videos if you're curious, but I'm going to update those for 2023 to see how things have changed. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a great evening.